All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that this program is being recorded and will be available on the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum website and YouTube page after this presentation. My name is Caroline McCarthy, and I am the Director of Community Engagement at the Farmhouse. I want to thank you so much for joining us for DFM's virtual lecture series, Talking About Race Matters, Join the Conversation. We at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum believe that one of the most important topics throughout history and today is the topic of race, and that it is crucial to have and facilitate conversations about race, even when they can be challenging. With this in mind, we created Talking About Race Matters, which is a lecture series that explores the topic of race through different themes each season. Our goal is that this session and others will encourage people to come together and engage in necessary conversation on a topic that can sometimes feel uncomfortable. In today's session, we will examine the role of urban planning in historic preservation and memorialization, delving deep into the crucial history and promising future of the Harlem African Burial Ground, a cemetery for free and enslaved Africans from the mid-1600s to the mid-1800s. The Harlem Burial Ground is a sacred site of New York City's early history, yet for decades the site was forgotten and disrespected. Through tireless research and advocacy, community advocates recently brought this history to light, and now the New York City Economic Development Corporation is leading efforts to properly memorialize and honor the people that were buried there. Today, we will hear from Sharon Wilkins, Manhattan Borough Historian Emerita, and leaders from the Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative and NYCEDC to learn more about the history of this site and its future as a memorial, cultural education center, and mixed-use project. During this lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please feel free to use the Q&A feature, and we will answer those questions at the end. Lastly, I want to thank you all again for attending, as well as sincerely thank our sponsor, the Ministry of Education, Culture, and Science of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, through the Dutch Culture USA Future 400 program of the Consulate General of the Netherlands in New York. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Sharon Wilkins, the Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative, and the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Thank you.
Okay, well, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to join you for this afternoon's discussion. In your introduction, you mentioned some items that were broader than just a generic history discussion, talking about race, talking about how we as a society and culture are positioned in these days and times. And so what I thought I would begin with is to ask you about the Dyckman Farmhouse, to get an update in terms of the site itself, what's happening now, why it continues to be an important part of your work, because in all of these spaces that are historic, that need to be uncovered, reclaimed, celebrated, recognizing the contributions of many, many people over time. It's important that we all in this space who do this work, share information. So if you would be kind enough to just give me a brief update on Dyckman Farmhouse, why it's important to you and what it means to all of you involved in this work, that would be helpful.
Thanks, Sharon. Sure. So for those of you that might be unfamiliar with the Dyckman Farmhouse, we are a Dutch farmhouse located in the Inwood neighborhood of Upper Manhattan. The Dyckmans were enslavers, so that is largely what we try to talk about in our programs, in our tours, and in our other visits to the farmhouse, is that history of enslavement on the site, as well as talking about the Lenape people that were here long before any Dyckman. So as part of that project, we launched our Dyckman Discovered initiative, which is a project whose main goal is to research the people that were enslaved there and tell their story in our space. We also are currently working on the Inwood Sacred Site project, which was an enslaved burial ground in the Inwood neighborhood of Manhattan. And we are working on a project to build a memorial on that site, as well as related programming around that history, which is why this theme for talking about Race Matters this February came about, and we wanted to hear about other sites doing similar work.
Well, that certainly, fits into the work that we're doing with the Harlem African Burial Ground.
Definitely.
So with that introduction, I guess I will begin talking about history and the burial ground. As many people may know, the discovery of the Lower Manhattan African Burial Ground several years ago led to a reawakening and emerging recognition and evaluation of such sites throughout the city, the state, and this nation. Ultimately, this new revelation led to an acknowledgement that free and enslaved Africans, many women, men, and children, whose unrespected, arduous, and tortured labor, although too often forgotten and disregarded, created the development of colonial Manhattan and certainly colonial America. While there has been many years of scholarship, research, and fact-finding, we do not know how many African-descended people were taken from the shores of the African continent to support European domination. In the quest for economic viability, agreed upon estimates suggest that the numbers range between 10 and 20 million individuals. This is a daunting fact to contemplate for many reasons. However dehumanized, mistreated, tortured, punished, raped, and experiencing all kinds of atrocities, certain facts could neither be denied or erased. Africans demonstrated their strength, tenacity, intellect, skill, established familial ties, multiple languages and cultures, and skills in a variety of disciplines. To note a few: labor, agriculture, mining, and metalworking. Over more than 400 years of strength, sacrifice, displacement, racism, violence, and multiple other ills, African Americans maintained the will to survive, persevere, and ultimately thrive, exhibiting enormous reservoirs of strength, skill, and faith. Adding a dimension to the practice of enslavement, racializing it became a definitively difficult circumstance. This concept, this practice, is not only demoralizing, but it's distinctly American. Notions of race, gender, and class existed in social and economic categories prior to the transatlantic slave trade. These issues would require distinct significance when the slave trade and slavery spread throughout the Americas. It is critical to note that the trafficking of human beings did little to disavow or remove the languages, cultures, familial ties, spirituality, and other sensibilities possessed by African peoples. It is against this backdrop and these realities that we begin to investigate attempts to disrupt and erase the history of the Harlem African Burial Ground. Much general history emphasized what occurred in the South. However, there is substantive history to recover, learn about, and teach regarding Black history in the North. The history of Harlem, as is the case with multiple national and local histories, developed through personal accounts, oral histories, written works, scholarship, research, church records, and other documents, is compelling and important. Histories of this nature are an important element of American history. African-descended people are instrumental to the growth and development of the city, state, and nation. To once again affirm what other centuries ago was lost, these people asserted their sheer will, strength, tenacity, and skill, and survival, forging new lives and surviving and thriving, even in the face of struggle and seemingly insurmountable obstacles. They also used their skills in multiple areas to build the village and the city. It is said that African descended people are a beautiful mosaic of mixtures and experiences that are timeless, having occurred over many centuries. However, one chooses to identify oneself Black, African, African American, Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Indigenous, Afro-Latino, and Afro-European. Black people represent centuries-long histories of difficult and enforced labor, tenacity, strength, expertise, skill, and determination, the capacity to have endured enforced labor that would make possible the building of this nation. Research supports the fact that the approximately 9-mile road from Lower Manhattan to New Harlem in the Dutch pronunciation and spelling was constructed by free and enslaved Africans. In fact, people of African descent were charged with responsibility for constructing and maintaining the colony's infrastructure. The village of Harlem was established by a royal decree granted by the Dutch government. The year was 1660. As long as 12 families and church presence was confirmed, the village could be formed. It was constructed on sacred land, first founded by indigenous people. Early in the 17th century, slave trading and slave ownership, although originally not well defined, became an accepted practice, even supported by scholars, theologians, and scientists. Additionally, historical records indicate that the original land transaction affected by the Dutch was understood to be a permanent acquisition, a notion not initially understood nor accepted by indigenous people. The Low Dutch Reformed Church of Harlem established 2 cemeteries, one for the internment of Europeans, commonly known as God's Acre. The second burial space, close to what would become the Harlem River, was authorized for the burial of people of African descent. It was known as the Negro or African Burial Ground. Life in this and other colonies was harsh. Enslaved persons were sold to plantation owners in New York and the Caribbean. Products produced required essential and often difficult and arduous labor. For example, sugar, coffee, cocoa, and tobacco, commodities that could be shipped to Europe. Desecration and disruption of the Negro or African Burial Ground in Harlem was instituted when the area's well-to-do residents would allow their animals to use the burial ground for grazing, even during the conduct of funerals. The Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx was established in the early 1860s. The families of European deceased persons were approached to ascertain whether they might want their relatives to be disinterred from God's Acre and reinterred in the Woodlawn site. No such accommodation was offered to the families of those whose loved ones had been buried in the Negro or African Burial Ground. Once again, African descended lives, stories, histories, and spiritual and religious agency could be ignored, lost, and forgotten. By the 1880s, the city was experiencing increased urbanization and construction, and the development of commercial spaces northward accompanied this transformation. The Harlem African Burial Ground was not incorporated and or acknowledged in these developments and plans. In fact, the Sosa family leased the property to operate a beer garden and carousel, evidencing further desecration of the site. Many groups of European descent used the facilities. They represented Italians, Israelis, Germans, and Spaniards. The space became the location for immigrant societies and multiple recreational activities. The lack of acknowledgement of the sacred and spiritual underpinnings of the site increased, so this was ignored. Later, the burial ground site was used for an army barracks, civic activities, private parties, and other events. Continued disruption occurred when New York City took control of the space. It was converted to accommodate a trolley barn. Subsequent to this acquisition, the site was further converted to a bus depot. Upon a reevaluation of transportation needs and a call to recognize the site's history and significance, accompanied by social and political intervention, the bus depot was decommissioned. A few years ago, an appeal was made to New York City to secure recognition of the site, its history, and importance. The application and defense was successful, so the Harlem African Burial Ground is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative continues to work with New York City to plan for the creation of an outdoor memorial and an indoor cultural education center. So I will stop there and thank you for your attention and examination of this part of New York and Harlem's history.
Great. Thanks, Sharon. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Dean Pierre. I'm a senior project manager with the New York City Economic Development Corporation, and we've been working with Sharon and other members of the initiative to help recognize this important project. So I'm going to do a little presentation to talk a bit more about our collaboration and the work that we're doing to memorialize this space. Just want to check, can you all see the screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. So I'll first give a little overview of the history and the background, talk through the project vision and some recent developments, and then we'll end with a Q&A portion. As Sharon sort of mentioned, talking about the location and the history of the burial ground, just want to give everyone a bit of context as to where the site is. So it is located in East Harlem off 126th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenues. The project site is a full city block, which is outlined in red here, and a portion of that site is the historic boundary of the Harlem African Burial Ground. And so if you look at the map on the right, it's a sort of yellow portion within the red city block here. Right now, it's occupied by a decommissioned MTA bus depot. MTA has since transferred that ownership to EDC, and it's currently being maintained by EDC. So here's what the site looks like today. As I mentioned, it's a full city block. It's a huge site. And as I mentioned, it was an active bus depot for many, many years. Right now, it's decommissioned. So we're working to allow the site to be recognized as the Harlem African Burial Ground with the memorial to really honor and restore respect to this site. I'll quickly go through the history, which Sharon touched on, how, this site was originally, established in the 1600s when the Dutch chartered on indigenous land, and they established the Low Dutch Reformed Church and had two segregated cemeteries. Once the city started expanding, they moved the plots of the white Europeans, but left those in the Harlem African Burial Ground behind. Once the land was sold and it changed hands, there was a number of different uses on the site. At one point, it was a beer garden, it was a movie studio, it was a trolley barn, and then eventually the bus depot that sits on top of the site today was built back in the 1960s. Moving now towards more recent history, it was in the early 2000s when the site was rediscovered through a documentary study that was done for the Willis Avenue Bridge Reconstruction Project. And through some research that was done independently through the Reverend of a church nearby, the Elmendorf Reformed Church, they ended up convening a group known as the Harlem African Burial Ground Task Force to advocate for the memorial. And so that group is now known as the Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative. As I mentioned, in 2015, the MTA decommissions the bus depot site. And it's this point when EDC began to get involved and was asked to help lead the redevelopment of the project. And so we commissioned a first phase archaeological investigation within the historic boundary of the burial ground, and we uncovered over 140 human remains on the site, which, confirmed the presence of this burial ground at this site. Those remains are now stored at the New York City Archaeological Repository until they can be reburied as part of the future memorial. Later on in 2017, this project went through the ULURP rezoning process, which is the city's process for public review on major projects. And this allowed the city to commit to establishing the outdoor memorial, an indoor cultural education center, as well as mixed-use development, which includes affordable housing. So all of this work wasn't done alone. It was done through, various advocacy and community organizing that was done by the Harlem African Burial Ground initiative. The predecessor of this group was known as the Task Force, and that was founded in 2009. And the members were Dr. Patricia A. Singletary, who is the former pastor of the Elmendorf Reformed Church. That is the descendant church of the Harlem African Burial Ground. And through her doctoral research, she actually uncovered a lot more evidence of the existence of the burial ground, including uncovering documents of the folks who were buried there, putting together family trees. And it was through this discovery which she helped to convene a group of leaders to help advocate for this site. Melissa Mark Viverito is also a member of this group, who is the former councilwoman and the city council speaker. Sharon Wilkins, who just spoke as a former Manhattan deputy borough historian, and also the former president of the New York chapter of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and then Melinda Velez, who is a former staffer for Melissa Mark Viverito. So it's this group who had partnered with EDC, and we've been working with them very closely since 2015 to determine a vision for the redevelopment site as part of the ULURP process, to guide archaeological fieldwork, and also co-host community events. As I mentioned, a lot of community organizing and engagement was done to determine a vision for this site. And this work started around way back in 2015, 2016. And this was done through the East Harlem Neighborhood Plan. And a lot of the priorities and action items outlined in this plan was done through major community engagement throughout East Harlem that was spearheaded by then council member Melissa Mark Viverito. The final plan was released in 2016 and was a guiding document for the ULURP that was then finalized in 2017. Some of the goals of the plan was to increase affordable housing and mixed-use opportunities in the neighborhood, update transit improvement regulations, and also rezoning the area to reactivate sites for development of more affordable housing, and that includes a portion of the Harlem African Burial Ground sites. Another goal of the plan was to really rezone the area so that sites of historical significance, like the burial ground, were able to receive those protections. So it was through that advocacy and work that the goals of the project site were able to be finalized and codified in the points of agreement letter as a part of the ULURP process. And so the ultimate vision for the Harlem African Burial Ground site is to establish a permanent outdoor memorial and an indoor cultural center to honor the burial ground's history and those who are buried there. And so as you see in this picture right here, the memorial would be on the historic footprint of the burial ground site, through this sort of draft image, though it's subject to change. But the idea is that the memorial exactly would not have any sort of physical building on top of it. We want to make sure that the memorial is an open space, that is a space for reflection, and to also make sure that folks have, or the site isn't further desecrated or disrespected. And in addition, there'll be a cultural center, a cultural education center, and there are opportunity to offer a variety of uses, which would include a museum and exhibition space, community facilities, and a visitor center. On the remaining portion of the site, the part of the site that doesn't include the boundary of the burial ground, will be a mix of uses. So mixed income housing, most of that will be affordable. Right now, we're estimating at least over 600 units, and 80% of those will be affordable, as well as some commercial space and retail space. In addition, included in the points of agreement was to enhance the streetscape and pedestrian connections and improve the public realm, and also make sure that this project is financially feasible and that we can support the cost of constructing and operating the memorial and the cultural center. So that's the overall vision of the site, but before anything gets built, we want to make sure we do our due diligence to make sure that this project is done in a very safe and respectful way. So as a part of this, we are doing archaeological work. We're embarking on a new phase right now in close consultation with the initiative to determine the complete distribution of human remains across the entire bus depot site versus just the historic boundary. And through this process, we'll recover any sort of remains and artifacts, protect them, analyze, and store them safely. And so that's being managed by Arman and AKRF, who did the work back in 2015, that initial Phase 1A investigation. In this new phase of archaeological work, we also included two bioarchaeologists who have expertise in studying human remains of African descent. And so now they are part of the team and are able to analyze any sort of artifacts or remains that we uncover and provide a bit more of a historical context and more sensitive analysis. And so right now that work kicked off back in June of 2024 and is ongoing. This work also includes consulting the indigenous nations that were local to New York City and the New York area, and also consulting them on the ways that they would like to see any sort of remains or artifacts preserved. Following that, there'll be lab analysis and reporting, and so we're hoping that for that work to be done by end of this year. While that archaeological work is going on, there's also an engagement component. So EDC, we have been working with Bridge Philanthropic Consulting, our engagement consultant, to work on this 18-month education engagement campaign whilst the archaeological work is going on. And so this is to really, host a lot of community events to raise awareness of the burial ground, to get people a lot more engaged and interested in what the future of the site is, and also to answer sort of any questions about the ongoing status of the project. So we've been doing multiple events throughout the year and this month, especially with Black History Month. And as you see in the photos, we had a little ceremony at the bus depot site when the archaeological work first kicked off, just to sort of, create a space for people to reflect, but also really like recognize this project milestone. And so all of this work is leading up to EDC and the initiative procuring an operator for the memorial and the cultural center. And so again, we want to make sure we're doing our due diligence to make sure that this project is done very respectfully and in a way that we're making sure that there's, making sure that the status of human remains is very much understood before we are doing any sort of construction or design. So in terms of the sort of scope for this operator, as I mentioned, the points of agreement letter committed to the permanent public outdoor memorial, as well as a community cultural education center. And that also included up to $1 million annually in operating expenses for this site. And so EDC will be collaborating with the Department of Cultural Affairs after all archaeological fieldwork is concluded and while education engagement is ongoing. We'll release an RFP to accept submissions for any sort of proposals for the operator and memorial design. And so we're hoping to do this as soon as archaeological work concludes. And so once this process begins and we're looking for potential collaborators to work on designing this site, we're really looking at a lot of precedents, especially within New York City, as ways of, figuring out ways to really honor and memorialize these sacred sites. So we're looking at places like the New Lots Library in Brooklyn, the Lower Manhattan National African Burial Ground Monument, as well as Abolitionist Place in Brooklyn as well. And with all these sites within New York, they were very thoughtfully designed and created and included a lot of symbolism and also had an extensive engagement to help decide, what are the sort of things that the community wants to see, what are the themes or the historical and cultural practices that we want to recognize in these sites. And so EDC and the initiative, we're excited to collaborate with GCLA to help identify, who would be a great partner for this and to create sort of a memorial design process. And so in terms of next steps, as I mentioned, archaeological work and engagement is ongoing. And so we'll be sharing any sort of updates through our Instagram and newsletter, which we have the QR codes here. And then the request for proposals for the operator of the Cultural Education Center will be released as soon as the archaeological fieldwork is completed. And so, yeah, you can scan the QR codes to receive any updates on the archaeological work as well as the events that we'll be having throughout the year. All right, and that's all I had to share. So I'll stop the presentation. I think we can begin the Q&A sessions.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon and Sarah Dean. And just a reminder for our viewers, if you have any questions for the presenters today, you can go ahead and use the Q&A function, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can. So our first question is this person is curious if the history of the Harlem Burial Ground was ever quote unquote lost in the case of the downtown burial ground, or did this history have to be reclaimed, or was it always in the public consciousness to an extent? Oh, we can't hear you, Sharon.
Sharon, yeah,
Sorry,
you're on
you're
mute.
muted.
Hey, Sharon, yeah, you're still on mute.
There we go.
These histories of African burial grounds, of African historic sites, all has to be recovered and reclaimed, because the traditional way of dealing with these histories and dealing with these spaces is to hope that no one knew about it. And regrettably, in New York City, as well as in other places, I'm sure, the traditional way of dealing with burial grounds and these historic sites, when they're originally found, is to pave over them, to create a parking lot or a garage or some other site, in the hopes that nobody would know. So work that the Harlem African Burial Ground Initiative and other groups are doing is to say, no, you cannot do that. This is part of our history. It's part of our heritage and culture. It is American history. And in a time and space where Black studies and other initiatives are being looked askance and not being taught, our work is intimately important.
Thank you, Sharon. It's a great answer to that question. Thank you. So our next question is asking what challenges you found in researching the people that were buried here, what records have been useful, and were there any resources that were surprisingly helpful?
I don't know that I would say that there were resources surprisingly helpful in terms of locating people who were actually buried there. We don't know how many people were, buried at the site. We do, however, we're fortunate to have uncovered approximately 30 names of individuals, which is very unusual.
Yeah.
But in one family, there were a couple of, generations in that family, and there was a family record that we were able to unearth and find. And then we found other documents, but that research is ongoing. And we know, unfortunately, we'll never recover the names of all individuals, but having recovered the names of 20-something, 30-something individuals is unusual.
Yes, that's very unusual. Just for reference, we up in Inwood haven't found names of anyone buried at the Inwood Sacred Site. So that's really incredible that you were able to uncover that information.
It's difficult work.
Yeah.
Difficult work because, because of the nature of slavery, because of the nature of, dehumanization, etc. And because of, the fear that that was part of people's daily existence, whether it was indigenous or African, keeping records was not a practice, largely because of people's protection.
Right.
The fear of being found out, the fear of being further desecrated and humiliated. So that's part of the difficulty in terms of record keeping, but research is ongoing.
Yeah.
We'll find out what we can.
Yes, definitely. So we have a couple follow-up questions to this one. This person is asking if there will be any next steps to include looking for descendants of the people that you have uncovered.
I would say that, to the extent possible, we will continue doing our research. We will continue trying to find, other documents, looking within the documents that we found already.
Yep.
Sometimes when you take another look, you find another clue. So I would say research will be ongoing. We'll uncover as much as we can about specific history and individuals and about general history.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So we have some people joining us who are researching similar sites and similar histories in the Boston area. They are curious about if there's a more thorough citywide study in New York City, given the success of this site and the site downtown. Is there kind of a larger project looking at all of the burial sites in New York that you're aware of?
Yes. I can't speak a lot about it right now because I'm just recently joining a board initiative, a new initiative, which is a nonprofit initiative to do just that.
Yeah.
To investigate sites all around New York and possibly beyond New York to see, how many sites are there? Where are they? What has been uncovered in, thus far? And then to come to some determination in terms of, how do we accumulate all this information? How do we continue to research it? How do we share it? So there are some initiatives in the works and I'm involved in that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. And I do want to add, so actually one of the archaeologists that we worked with, her name is Elizabeth Mead. She actually did her dissertation on cemeteries in New York and created a website and a map feature that maps out the burial grounds that are known, at least within New York City. So I can link that resource in the chat for folks to look into.
That would be super helpful. Thank you, Sardine. Thank you. Let's see. So our next question is asking if if you guys working on this project have collaborated with the African Cemetery National Monument at 290 Broadway in any way.
Yes, we have, and I am fortunate to have worked on various of these sites around. I worked with folks at the Lower Manhattan African Burial Ground. In fact, Shirley McKinney, who's the National Park Service supervisor there, and I are not only colleagues, but we've become friends. So I continue to engage with that site. I've worked on Seneca Village in Central Park, and certainly on this, I visited Dykeman's Farmhouse and other sites around. So I've been engaged in this for several years.
Yeah.
And we'll continue that engagement.
Definitely, definitely. And we have a talk about a Seneca Village program in a couple of weeks. So if you're interested in Seneca Village, definitely take a look at that. So we have a question about the plans for this space. Is the amount of open green space dedicated in the plans able to be increased at all to allow greater space for reflection as well as environmental benefits so greatly needed in Harlem?
I'll let Sarah Dean
Yeah.
handle some of the structural areas, but what I can say is we want to be very thoughtful and respectful of the site. The outdoor memorial, in addition to memorializing the Africans in general and their contribution, but certainly those who were interred there, the outdoor space we intend to be, you know, culturally, artistically respectful. There are also some indigenous remains that have been uncovered. So it's broad-based thinking in terms of, but we certainly will incorporate an area or areas for reflection and memorialization, certainly, and remembrance.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, we had the ULURP and the points of agreement letter, which established the square footages for the outdoor space, but those are just minimums. You know, we wanted to at least include the boundary of the historic burial ground, but we are definitely open to expanding that area. And like Sharon mentioned, we're also in conversations with Indigenous nations, and we want to incorporate their feedback in terms of how this is designed. And so, yeah, absolutely. We definitely want to see if there are opportunities to expand the area, incorporate elements of their culture as well. So yeah, ongoing discussions are happening, but there's definitely room for us to play with that.
Great, thank you. So I think I will close with one last question for you. And I know, Sarah Dean, you shared some links and QR codes at the end of your slides, but some of our viewers are wondering how they can get involved with this project.
Yeah, so actually I'll share my screen again actually with those QR codes.
Great.
But as with our education consultant with the initiative, we're hosting a series of events throughout Black History Month, but also throughout the year. We're doing some family history workshops as well as presentations on the burial ground. So I'll pull up those QR codes for you to be able to contact the group so we can maybe potentially set up a meeting. And also you can stay informed on sort of the events that we're having. So sorry, let me
Yeah, no worries.
share. Okay. And then I'll, oops, yeah, right here. So I'll leave that on for a few more minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I want to thank you both again for this incredible discussion. I enjoyed it, and I know our viewers did as well. I also want to let you all know that if you enjoyed this presentation, you can join us again 2 weeks from today on Zoom for the last presentation of this series. This talk will be called Envisioning Seneca Village, and we'll discuss a digital project related to the site in Central Park, New York City. So you can register for this upcoming lecture through the link in the chat or on our website, dykemanfarmhouse.org. I would also ask you to consider making a donation to the Dykeman Farmhouse Museum to allow us to continue to offer free public programming like this one. Gifts in any amount are sincerely appreciated. I want to thank you again, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Great. And thank you so much for hosting us.
Of course. Thank you both.